Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. Well, the Prime Minister is back from his UK trip, and, for that matter, I guess his trip to the United Nations in New York a few days before that. Was it successful? Is it going to pay dividends for Canada? Well, that kind of depends on who you ask. If you want to go to the bottom end of the scale, well, there's opposition leader Pierre Poilievre that says that this is just a waste of time, nothing but liberal showmanship and show business, he says. Poilievre has displayed time and time again that he has a very limited capacity to try to understand economics and global affairs. So it's easy to dismiss this. As a matter of fact, we should dismiss an awful lot of what Poilievre says, especially in this case. But I do want to talk a little bit about why the Prime Minister is doing what he's doing and what we can expect in the way of payback, I suppose, is the word that is oftentimes used. But first of all, though, I find it interesting that while Poilievre and Peter MacKay, a former cabinet minister under the Harper government, continue to just natter away and say this is a waste of time, these guys don't know what they're doing, which is what they do. I mean, they're really good at nattering. That seems to be what they major in. The reality here is that you need to lay the groundwork for trade deals. We know we're in a rather precarious economic position. We know that there's going to be a federal budget coming out. We also know that sometime in the next few months, Canada is going to have to sit down with the United States for serious renegotiations of the CUMSA deal. That's the revised NAFTA deal, of course. And that's going to be very difficult. And so, yeah, the sand is running out of the hourglass here. We only have a limited amount of time to try to do what we can to stabilize the Canadian economy. There seems to be major consensus in most circles, except for some people on the extreme right, that we need to diversify. That doesn't mean stop dealing with the United States, but we have to deal with them less and become less dependent on that. Well, what's the way to do that? It's to create international markets in other areas where maybe we've done some trade before, where that needs to increase, and to fortify those certainly, but at the same time to create new opportunities and new deals. Well, you don't do that by sitting by the phone in Ottawa waiting for that to happen. You got to get out there. You've got to cultivate those deals and those relationships, and that's what the Prime Minister is doing. It's worthy of noting that when he was in New York for the United Nations General Assembly, which he addressed, of course, and also was a member of a number of the summits that were taking place there, numbers that I saw from a couple of different reports, there were upwards of 700 requests from various world leaders, diplomats, and world business leaders to want to sit down and talk with Mark Carney while he was there. What does that tell you? That tells me that the movers and shakers, the decision makers, the policy makers, not just here in Canada, but globally, and the business leaders globally want to talk to Mark Carney. When's the last time we've seen that happen, where those groups of people want to sit down with our Prime Minister and talk business? Doesn't happen very often, but it's happening now. We need to seize that opportunity. And Carney seems to understand that. Of course he understands that. Sadly, some people on the other side of the aisle there in Parliament don't seem to get that, or simply don't want you to think that they can get that. Sad one way or another. The old idea about, one Canada working together was certainly lost on these guys. They just simply don't want to play ball and seemingly want to do everything they can to try to dissipate any traction that the government's getting. So Let's ignore that and start talking about the positives and some of the realities here, too. Trade deals, yeah, we need more trade deals. We talked about renegotiating the CUMSA deal. How long does it take to get a deal? And do not use Donald Trump, that clown in the White House, as a barometer as to how this gets done. Trump, of course, sits down with a world leader, whether it's the leader of the UK, France, the European Union, and like an hour and a half later says, we got a deal. Well, that's crap. It's BS, and everybody in the world knows it's BS. But we've got to take that into consideration when we're looking at the reality here. And by the way, that's simply underscored by the fact that just about every one of those areas, whether it's the EU, the Japan deal, so to speak, and others, have fallen apart as soon as some of the American journalists are saying, "Well, what about this part?" He said, "We never agreed to that. That was never even in the discussion." It takes time. Give you an example of this, okay? The first deal that we signed with the United States, we've many deals, of course, from the Auto Pack and so many others, but the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, the original NAFTA that was signed, took almost 2 years. 2 years to negotiate before they finally found a consensus and put all those deals down on paper, by the way, so that there was a deal, something to show people and say, here's the NAFTA deal. 24 months for that to happen. The revised deal that we were forced to sign with the Trump administration during his first term, Kuzma deal in our case, that took over 14 months to renegotiate. And that was based on the current deal. In other words, they weren't starting from a blank sheet of paper. It still took 14 months to come to some sort of a deal and a consensus. And again, all of the articles of agreement were outlined in the document, and it was signed by both parties. You may remember that Trump said it was the greatest trade deal of all time. He doesn't seem to think so now, or maybe he just doesn't seem to think. Maybe that's more to the point. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership, another great deal, by the which Canada was a part of, thankfully, which was a great idea to try to open up markets in the Asia-Pacific area. It took almost 7 years, really, to negotiate that deal off and on because there's so many players in that one. But the point here and the message here, the takeaway from all of those is it takes time for these things to happen. Okay, you can't go and have a weekend trip with Prime Minister Starmer in the UK and come back and says, we've got ourselves a deal. No, we don't. They want to have a deal. They've talked about this. This is not new. The discussions between a stronger deal between the UK and Canada have been going on ever since the UK left the European Union. Dumbest move they've ever made. And it takes time because there are contentious items. The import of a Canadian beef over there. Some of the folks over in the UK are not crazy about the way that's raised here. The dairy industry is a very contentious issue, as it has with most negotiations with the European Union, certainly with the United States too. So these things are going to have to be negotiated. There's going to be give and take with these, and it's not going to get done overnight, which is why it takes so much time. You want to make sure that you get it right and that there are going to be guarantees and make sure that people are going to be in agreement with this and there's going to be compliance with this. It's a very intricate deal. Poilievre clearly doesn't seem to understand that, but I suppose we should cut him some slack because he's never negotiated anything. That's why it's so important to have somebody with Mark Carney who's got that expertise and that experience in global affairs and global economic affairs to be able to talk about these sorts of things. It's going to take time, but it's got to be done properly, or there'll be no foundation at all, and things just tend to fall apart, as you can see happening with the American economy these days. So I'm as anxious as every other Canadian. I want to see a deal too. I want to see something happen. And we sometimes, as Canadians, we get a little antsy about these sorts of things, and it's very difficult for us to be patient. But you need to be patient for these things to be done and to be done properly. So this is one of the things that we have to talk about. And of course, the other factors that the government is cognizant of is what else is going around us. Yeah, we need to talk about these new markets. We need to look at Asian markets, trade with China. We talked about that on a previous podcast, which was taboo, although we do trade with China. Aside from the United States, China is it's our second largest trading partner. Business is going on, and that doesn't mean you have to love everybody on the other side of the fence and respect them, but you need to understand that there is an economic argument to be made for continuing to do business with them, and we need to be able to do that. So we can't be naive about the negotiations here. There's an advantage here. There has to be an advantage for Canada for these things to work. So the talks with China, the talks with the United States, the talks with the UK are all very important to the Canadian economy. So when some of the critics, and God knows there's enough of them in the right-wing media these days, saying, well, not enough is being done. If you want to talk about doing something to alleviate the higher cost of living, trade deals, more jobs, more well-paying jobs, and international investment in this country is clearly the path to doing that. Well, again, it's not just going to happen. You got to work at it, and that's what this government seems to be doing. And, I just talked a few minutes ago about the time frame for some of these trade deals. 18 months for this one, 24 months for this one, on and on it goes. Carney's only been the Prime Minister for 9 months. So is it really legitimate to expect that, hey, why haven't you signed a bunch of deals now? It's crazy, isn't it? But he's making inroads. He's creating those relationships, and that's an important first step in making that happen. I wish it would happen tomorrow, but we have to be realistic about that. That you have to build those things, and you have to look at their needs against our needs, and you can't negotiate a deal. Well, I was going to say like Trump does. Trump doesn't negotiate; he just demands. But you can't just say, "Here's our list of demands," and expect the other side to capitulate. That's not what a deal is. There's a negotiation. There's give and take, as we've talked about, and Carney understands that. By creating those relationships, as he has done, hopefully there's going to be a foundation for that. Because and Carney has talked about this. The government, plus the other ministers besides Carney, have talked about this. They're aware of what the other concerns are. Cost of living is a major problem. Certainly it is. The tariffs that are going on here and the impact that's having on prices, that's part of the cost of living. Trump's not going to just say, hey, I'm sorry, I really pissed you guys off. I didn't realize it was going to have such an impact on your quality of life in Canada. I'm going to drop all the tariffs. That's not going to happen. We're going to have to help heal ourselves. And that's by counteracting those tariffs, not just by doing our own tariffs, but by cutting deals with other parts of the world so that we can reduce our dependence on those American goods and some of that American trade. And again, that takes time for it to happen. I know it sounds trite to simply say, hey, guys, we got to be patient. But we got to be patient if you want to see this thing last, and if you want to see a lasting deal that's going to be good for Canada. And I know that it gets awfully frustrating sometimes when you hear the comments of people like Poilievre, who, I don't know whether this guy just doesn't get it. I'm starting to look like there's more and more evidence that seems to be the case. Or maybe he's a lot smarter than we seem to think he is, and he's just playing politics. Either way, it's bad for Canada, and it's bad for Canadians, and you don't want to see somebody who's in public life, I don't care what political stripe they are, when we're in an economic situation like this, you'd like to think that there's going to be some consensus within Parliament to say we got to work together on this. The Prime Minister has worked those deals and created those relationships with the premiers, and God knows they're not all on the same page, from political parties to political ideologies. And there's still some big differences there. We get that too. But there seems to be at least a consensus among the premiers and the Prime Minister to go in the same direction and discuss, points of contention, etc. That doesn't seem to be the case in Parliament. The hooting and hollering and the idiotic child's play that we see from some of the opposition members during question period right now just indicates that these guys, first of all, probably don't even understand the gravity of the situation and have no concept of trying to find solutions to it. They just want to play politics. It's childish and it's counterproductive to what we need right now from our elected leaders. That's it for this edition of the podcast. So glad that you could be with us, as always. If you're on YouTube, great to have you with us. Don't forget, hit that notification bell. And thanks, as always, to everybody for hitting the subscribe button as well. Lots to talk about during these very important times, and your support through your subscription can help us to continue our work here on the podcast. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.